Alright guys, today we're back to work on the C6 competition drift car build. We are on the home stretch and we are also on a time crunch to get this thing done. So we got all of the electronics powered up. We've tested just about everything. Everything seems to work. We hooked up to the ECU, the dash, we updated all of the firmwares, the PDM's working, things like the headlights and stuff are working, all the stuff's doing things. So that's a big milestone to have out of the way, and now we're just continuing on down the path. We're getting really close to firing this thing up. We gotta crimp those lines, fill it with oil, prime it, get our injector harness in, bada bing, bada boom, fire it off. But we still have some other stuff to take care of in between then. If we consult the list here, we're kind of putting off these things that are dotted with pink dots are things that we cannot do in an AC garage. Cutting and installing hood vents, trimming the rear firewall, trimming the dash, sealing all that up. It's just gonna make a bunch of fumes. So we are kind of trying to put that off to the last possible minute because it is hot and we are spoiled now by working in AC. So we're trying to avoid that. But we got plenty of other stuff to do. That being said, I'm not even gonna try to tell you what we're gonna get into. We're just gonna get to working, start hammering projects out and see how far along we can get this thing today, / tomorrow, / however long it takes to film this video. So enough jibber jabber, let's get to work. So the first project I wanted to tackle was finishing up our front structure that holds the intercooler and the oil cooler. We were missing one bracket. We needed to make a third mounting point for the oil cooler so that it couldn't twist or slide down or do anything weird like that. Simple little bracket, not too crazy, but we do need to cope it a little bit to match the bracket that we're welding it to that holds the oil cooler on. It has a curve to it at the tip and we want to get as much weld distance as possible. So we switched to the more aggressive belt on the belt grinder to do some shaping with this piece of mild steel, get it kind of rough fit to shape, test fit it back on, and then figure out where we want to cut the bottom to match the angle of the oil cooler, mostly for aesthetics, but for function too. We want to keep everything tucked up as high as possible. So with the shape figured out, the shape all ground down and fitting up pretty nice, it's time to just clean it up. So we switch back to the Scotch-Brite belt. This belt is really good for cleaning off hard edges and burrs and all that stuff, and just making the finished piece look like something that's done and finished, not with all these jagged edges on it. So now that we're happy with the fit up, we've got it where we want it, it's time to tack it on. Now we're going to tack it on in the car because it kind of has some odd angles to it. Now, unfortunately, the magnet did not want to hold this thing in place for very long, so we had to be quick and get a tack on this thing before the magnet slid down again. But once it was all tacked together, we could take the whole front end back apart, get this thing off and on the bench, get it welded up so we can finally be done and dusted with it. Now, before we pull this off, we need to know where our hole in our oil cooler is. So we pull the bash bar off, get that out of the way, and then we throw a transfer punch in the threaded hole on the oil cooler, slide it back into place, tap it with a hammer, and now we have our hole. So that way when we pull this off, we can get that hole drilled, not have any loose ends left to tie up when it's time to put it all back together. So we finished ripping this thing apart. It's a pretty easy process. We did a decent job, kind of engineering this to be serviceable. We get it out of the way, get it on the bench, and go ahead and weld up this bracket. Now this is tricky because this being so long in one weld right on the end, it wants to pull a lot. So I tried to clamp it to the table and just keep it as flat and straight as possible. But it's an odd thing to account for because it's not perfectly in line with the oil cooler. So it needs a little bit of curve, but you don't want too much curve. It's tricky. Fab work can be tricky, even the simplest of projects. But once that's done, we can tackle the last odd end of this build out and go ahead and get some speed holes drilled in the other side. Now these serve two purposes. They're one there for aesthetics, but they're also there as kind of a strength relief. If we were to get in a wreck, hopefully these pieces will bend. We want them to be strong, but not too strong. So anyway, we got all that done. The front end is officially complete. All right, got this thing all welded up. Went ahead and drilled the holes in this side. So now we got speed holes in both sides. So aside from paint, this thing is done and dusted. Now, before we put the front end back together, we want to get the back half of the exhaust on. So this is the next portion and this is the last portion. So we also took advantage of the front end being apart, and Josue got our 2 sensor block mounted here. So this is for crankcase pressure and vacuum. We have a map sensor here, then we have our back pressure sensor, then we have 2 M5 connections to go to fuel temp and oil temp. So the wiring reach plugged in, that spot worked out perfect. So before we put the exhaust on, Josue's working on a heat shield here for the side of the trans tunnel, and that's because the exhaust is going to run down that side, and drift cars get hot, man, especially when you're hot lapping them. So we've got this Mishimoto heat shielding. Just keep the temps down inside the cockpit. You know, the LS Miata gets hot inside, and we have carpet and insulation in that thing. So heat management, heat management, heat management. So anyway, while he's working on that, I want to work on getting my ground pigtails done. So we've got some here in the front and some in the back. And once those are done, we can just plug things in and test them all the way through. Basically, I'm gonna get to wiring. Josue's gonna try to figure out how to mount this thing. Probably with rivets. Yeah, seems like a good plan. All right, enough jibber jabber. Back to wiring / shielding. So with the way I decided to do my front and rear harnesses, instead of making the grounds integrated and bolt in, I made them integrated, but they go to a connector, and then that connector is gonna bolt into the chassis. So not that you pull the harness often, but if you were to pull the harness, you would just disconnect plugs, only plugs, not have to take any bolts off. Decided to do it this way, make it a little nicer. So we get the first ground pigtail done basically from the connector to the ground location. We hadn't had these done. We went to test things and remembered, oh wait, we don't have grounds without those pigtails. So we test the first side, it works, it goes well. So then we move on to building the other side. This one has 3 wires instead of 2 wires, but basically the same thing. And this is a good example of how much time wiring takes compared to other projects. It took me more time to make these 3 harnesses, which, as you can see, pretty straightforward, pretty simple process. I've got it pretty down packed by now after building this whole harness. It still took me more time than it took me to make that bracket and weld it onto the front end for our oil cooler. It's tedious. Even when you're moving quick, even when you're grooving and everything's going well, it's still tedious and time consuming. So with the other front harness done, we moved on to the rear harness sections, the rear ground pigtails. Now these are a lot beefier than the front. These are all our high current stuff. We got our fuel pumps, our fans. The only light current thing is our interior lights, which we tied into the same ground pigtail, so that way we don't have an extra wire there that we've got to disconnect. It is all disconnectable. So we get those all built. We go ahead and toss the front one in. Now we needed a good ground location, so I went ahead and drilled and tapped this aluminum bar just to have a nice good ground location for these. We tested them out, and it all worked well, as one would expect. It worked before the ground. All we had to do was add a ground. And with that done, it was done tinkering with the wiring. Josue was done with the heat shield. And now we could put the exhaust on, because again, we want to get the exhaust on before we put the front end on, because it's a lot easier to get to all of these clamps with the front end off. Now, this is a 2-person job, especially now since everything's been apart. We have to get everything lined up perfect. This is a 4-inch downpipe through a Corvette with a front transmission. There is not a lot of room for error. Everything is super tight. I really took my time when I built this and tried to make all of this stuff fit, and it fits, but it is tight. 4 inches, a lot of exhaust through there. Exhaust reinstalled. It's a little tight there with the heat shield, but you can see we're shielded pretty much all the way by the trans to here, at least where it's really close to the trans and the bell housing, so that should help. And then the heat shield Josue threw in should hopefully keep me from cooking my feet too bad, and keep us from cooking everything else. Now I can start building the rest of the exhaust. All right, it's the start of a new day, and we've got a bunch of odds and ends parts in that I've been waiting on. We got some oddball fittings. We have our back pressure canister. We have our fuel injector harness. This is a big one, and our throttle cable. This is another big one. Now this is one of those small things that has been bugging me. So there's that, but what I'm gonna start on is the injector harness. So I'm pretty pumped on this. I didn't even know this existed. So I was just gonna get a standard Holley injector harness, but they came out with this nice mil-spec harness. And I've gotta say, after building a bunch of harnesses, I understand why mil-spec stuff like this is so expensive. These boots, the heat shrink, these boots, these splits, and these tees, these are like $20 each, $20 to $30. This is probably a $30 boot right here. Stuff is pricey, and then the mil-spec wire. So I was real happy that I could just get a Holley injector harness and not have to make it myself. This is a nice piece. So the one thing we have to do though is we need to crimp this connector on where our injector connector is, right here for the standard Holley injector harness. So to do that, we need to pull this harness out. To do that, we need to pull the intake off. So we got a little bit of work to do. I'm glad we never bolted the intake back down fully, because we'll be taking it right back off. But let's get this engine harness out, get that finalized, and try to finalize anything else on it. It's still kind of just in there from the rough fit. So I'm gonna quit jibber jabbering. We're gonna get back to work. You know the deal. So the first step is pulling the intake off and pulling our wiring harness out. You get used to taking things apart and putting them back together when you're building a car like this, but it really helps you for the future. And with that done, started working on getting our injector harness pinned on. Now, luckily, we don't have to build a whole harness, but we do have to pin it onto this wiring branch here. Now, I started out by depinning this connector, but depinning OEM connectors is never fun. And I was like, you know what? We don't need all this wire length. I'm just going to cut it off. So went ahead and cut it off. We had to label, you know, what each wire is. I have the wiring schematic for the Holley harness, so I know where each wire goes, what is signal, what is power, what's all the stuff that we need to the injectors, because we need to obviously pin those into the right spot in the connector that we're pinning on here. So we get them all stripped. We get the pins all put on. It's the same Deutsch style connector we've been working with, a little bit smaller pins, but same process, same crimper. So real easy. We fly right through this, no problem at all. We get the connector pin. We write down our own pin out just so we have it and we know for the future. And then we test to verify that we got it right. And then I plug it in and test from the bulkhead connector at the firewall all the way to each injector to verify they're in the right spot. This is something, if not done, if it's wrong, could bite us and fight us a lot. Cross-checked, verified. We're good, brother, we're good. Sure about that. All right, we got our injector harness all pinned up, verified from tip to tail. Well, from here to the bulkhead connector, which I've already checked that before with the old injector plug to verify that these pins are all in the right place with the pins on the inside with the pins on the ECU. So we know those are good, and then from here, each injector, A1, we're good to go. So that's done. It does kind of kill me though, because it looks so good, and I wish we could have done the rest of the harness this way, but it would have required depinning all the connectors, which we just did not have time for. But one day we'll redo it, and the whole engine harness will look like this, like the chassis harness does. I'm trying to make it nicer than the chassis harness. But anyway, our goal was to finish everything that needs to be done with the intake off, so we could officially bolt the intake back on, torque it down, be done with that, hopefully. However, we need a different wrench for this one coolant line. We got the fuel lines tight, but that one coolant line is just really difficult to get to. We're getting to that point where we got to go through the whole car and nut and bolt it, because you know pretty much everything on here is on hand tight, because you're mocking it up, you're taking it on and off. So like we've literally got to go through every nut and bolt on this car besides like the engine and trans, and make sure everything's tight, every fitting, every line. That is an easy thing to skip. And then you go to start the car and oil pours everywhere or something. So speaking of lines, Josue got this line remade. We made it a little too short the first time. Ow. So it was just kind of in the way of the fuel hat. So he went ahead and remade that to keep it tucked nice down here by the radiator. We were gonna go ahead and do this line so the cooling system would be done. However, I decided last minute that I want to add a swirl pot, which will basically allow the air to escape from the coolant coming back from the engine before it goes into the radiator, so that way you're only pumping water through the radiator, maximizing its cooling efficiency, and you're getting as much air out of the cooling system as possible. So I think that's like a must do, and it's just one of those things that popped into my head as we started on this. So anyway, I'm jibber jabbering. I'm gonna move on to painting this. I was gonna paint it gray to match the chassis, but I don't wanna bolt this all back together just to know I'm taking it back apart. I'd like to finalize this since all of this other stuff's pretty much finalized. So I'm just gonna paint it black. So let's head out to the paint booth and get this thing sprayed up. So before I threw paint on this thing, I put a tiny little bend in the end of this third bracket for the oil cooler just to kind of straighten it out and get it just right. We also had to, of course, drill some speed holes in it just to lighten it up and make it look a little nicer. So with that done, we headed outside to the paint booth. This wonderful bench that was here when I got this house works perfect if you throw a piece of cardboard on it. So we got some paint thrown on it, and while I was waiting on it to dry, I went ahead and started reinstalling our harness. Now this is a bit of a chore. It's not too bad. In the grand scheme of things, it's not too bad, but just everything's a little tight. We run most of it under the intake, and there's just a lot going on under this intake manifold, so trying to get all the connectors in the right place and sort all that out is tricky, and we had a little bit of trouble getting the coil pack harnesses to reach to the right spot, but I flipped them, and that all works now. It's really clean. They hide under the intake, but you have to kind of put them on in unison with the intake, which I'm not too fond of, but one of those things. It's a balance between function and form, and just in general, it's always a balance. So get the intake rough back on, and then I start moving on to the odds and ends. That's what this part of the build is all about, and that's why it's easy to get lost in this last 20% of the work, and there's just so many little things to do, and it's easy to put certain things off until the last minute, and then you realize you need to get them done. So I'm just tackling any project that comes my way, anything I think of. One of those is adding connectors to our fans and water pump. Now, I don't plan to keep these fans long term, but I wanted to at least get them connected. We're probably going to have to use them short term. So with that done, with some of my wiring and connectors done, I wanted to get the front end assembled now that the paint was dry on our front end bar, intercooler, oil cooler holding assembly. I don't know what you'd want to call this thing. It's definitely not a bash bar. Our bracketry, our front end bracketry. So I wanted to get that all reassembled now that we had that third oil cooler mount bracket, make sure that all fit good and that everything went back together. And now that we've got this painted, we can actually tighten everything down. We're finally at that stage of the build where when we put something on, it's hopefully for the last time. And we can tighten it down. You know, normally in the mid-build process, you're just putting everything on by hand. So it feels weird to go through and actually tighten the bolts down, you know, with a wrench or a ratchet when you put something together. But we got the front end assembled. I moved on to some more connectors. Just a lot of connectors, all right? There's a lot of connectors. So we made everything disconnectable. There's a lot of connectors. So one of those things was the boost control solenoid, getting a connector on it so we could figure out where we wanted to mount it and start plumbing it. And then I did a fun little easy project and went ahead and swapped in my new steering wheel. So I have this Sawbelt one, same one I used in my Miata. I really like this steering wheel. So I went ahead and got it tossed onto the hub so that we could toss it into the car and just see what it looked like, sit in it, make vroom vroom noises. You know how it goes. It's one of those things. Sometimes it'll get you back motivated to just sit in the car, pretend to roast some gears. All right, we've just been chugging away at all of these odds and ends. So the wiring harness fits good. So all that's squared away. We just got to tighten that one fitting. Then we can put the intake on for sure. But again, we've been tackling the odds and ends. I've been putting connectors on everything that needs connectors, like the boost control solenoid. Josue's starting on the Wastegate Lines. So yeah, whoever ordered these fittings didn't order any straights. I don't know who that guy was. I don't know why he didn't order any straight fittings. Not a single one, but he didn't order any straights. Now I decided to use 4AN, and the reason for that is if one of these lines melts and opens up, basically our wastegates will stay shut and the car will just make as much boost as it possibly can, which would be catastrophic. Now we can set safeties in the ECU, but we don't want that to happen. So we're gonna do robust AN line and sleeve it, trying to foolproof this thing. So anyway, we got that done. Happy with that. Josue's working on those lines and fittings. We got the fan wiring plugs done, got the water pump done. Now I unhooked this just to show you a little test here. So this is pretty neat. Built a delay in with the race pack software. They made it really easy. So I delayed one fan from the other. So the first fan's gonna come on, then a few seconds later, the second fan. And the reason for that is the fans draw a ton of current on startup. I know on the Miata, I haven't checked it on this, it's about 50 amps at startup per fan. And then it drops down to like 15 amps when they're running. So instead of having both those fans hit at the same time, one will come on and then the second one will come on a few seconds later. So check it out. Power on. So there's fan one and then fan two. To actually pull a decent amount of air, we are planning on doing bigger fans than that, and I'm gonna build a shroud, but we're having to pick and choose our battles right now, and if these work, hopefully they're good enough to get us through the first event and some testing, and then we'll address that later. It's just not the most efficient setup it could be. So anyway, a whole lot of jibber jabber to update you and just say we are chugging along. I'm very happy with the progress, and we're just gonna keep it on. So I think I'm gonna start working on the fire suppression system. It's one of those things that we could afford to not do. However, in theory, now our first time using this car would be the absolute best time to have it, because if anything's gonna go wrong, it's way more likely that it goes wrong then than later once we've got the car dialed in. So I really wanna make sure we put a priority on this. So I'm gonna unbox this, see if we can't get it mounted up. All right, so a few things here after unboxing this. One, the way it's designed is to have 3 nozzles in the engine bay, two in the cockpit. Now, I really want to put a nozzle back spraying at the fuel cell in case we have a fire there. To do that, they didn't really include the right T's to do that because it's not set up to do that. So I went ahead and ordered another T, which I'm going to need to do it the way I want it. We should have enough nozzles. We'll have two inside the car. We'll have two in the engine bay and then one in the fuel cell. So we'll have to wait till we get those in to install this. This is like the third time we tried to install this and found something. Sway found some P-clamps, so he's working on finishing P-clamp in the fuel lines. Oh, you know what we should have done while you're down there is start working on the cable to the starter. Yeah, I mean, we could start messing with that. I can get them drawn out. Like I said, we're at that point of the build where we're just bouncing around, so I'm gonna just get back to work. I'll let you know what we get into. So the task we landed on was, you guessed it, more wiring. We're pretty much done, I promise, but we've got a couple heavy gauge cables to run. So I went ahead and got the end crimped on for Josue to run the power wire to the starter direct from the battery, and I started working on the power wire to our power steering pump. So this is a big one. It's long. It's got a weird convoluted route. I wanted to get it done. It's something that we can't really drift or drive the car without. So it seems low priority, but it's actually pretty high priority. Now, another wire that needed to go over there is the wire to our external kill switch button. So I decided to run them together and sleeve them. Now, I used black wire because I wasn't going to sleeve it, but then when I had to add the other wire, I decided to sleeve it, and the sleeve is just so nice and so functional, but man, it was a chore. It's a chore to get it on in general. The longer the run, the more of a chore, but this one was a struggle. We used air, we had a pull-through cable, we did everything we could, and we managed to get it through, get it cleaned up, get it heat shrunk, and then we could install it in the car. Now again, it has a pretty weird route. It's got to go up and over and all the way to the driver's side, so it's a tricky one to get right and do in a nice clean way, but we got it done. We got it across. We got it to where it needs to go, which is a small victory, but a victory nonetheless. All right, been chugging away, finished up the kill switch button wiring. Just had to add in the external button here, which I put it on a connector. So this is our external kill switch. So like a fire marshal, or you know, if you wreck the car, you have to have a way to kill it externally so they can shut the power off if it was on fire, you're stuck inside. So I got that here, and I ran it with the wire for the power steering pump. However, this is the first time I pulled this connector off, and it is melty. And these connectors are very difficult to find, so I might have to buy like a whole used little harness just to nab the connector off of. And I realized that this is broken too on here, so that's kind of lame. But we got that all done, grounded, yada yada. Josue got the wastegate lines done. These are some beefy wastegate lines. They're heat sleeved. This one was super short, so we didn't sleeve it, but got off the compressor housing, boost controller, teed, gate 1, gate 2. I also got the oil feed off the filter housing through our dry brake, which is down there, to the turbo, coolant line back on. Chugging away, man. Chugging away. What else do we do? I feel like I did something. I spent a lot of time messing with the kill switch thing. I was having some issues with it back feeding power. Boost controller's mounted. We got our mount in. Josue got it mounted. So boost control is officially done. I mean, this is all hooked up, wired. Oh, I've got to put one wire in on the inside. Almost officially done. Almost. But yeah, so we got one line to make here for the blow-off valve to the intake manifold. We've got to do probably just a regular hose to the to the fuel pressure regulator here, because I can't seem to find this thread to AN. But that is a really important hose, so it's tricky. And yeah, chugging along. But that being said, we're out of time. We've been working at this for days. That's the tough thing with the wiring, is it takes more time. It's really tedious for the amount of progress you get done. I really enjoy it, but it is tedious. And we spent several days. It just takes longer to make each episode and get enough stuff done to be happy with it. So it's tricky, but I think we got enough. I think we're good. Exhaust is back on. Probably dive into making the back half of the exhaust here soon. Go get those lines crimped so that we can put oil in it and try to start it, get a base tune on it. We're close. Hopefully next episode we'll start it. I don't want to get you guys' hopes up. I'm not going to say that we are going to start it next episode, but there is the potential there. Like, in theory, tighten those lines, secure the intake, to lock everything down, put fuel in it, put oil in it, crimp those lines, We got the battery cable ran. Right? I mean, you know, it's close. I can't think of much more that we need to do to at least start it up and hear it fire up. So anyway, hopefully that's in store for you. If not, I'm sorry. Anyway, thanks for watching. Thanks for subscribing. I really hope to see you next time. But if not, it's okay too. Okay, goodbye.